Hello and welcome to this third session today called Britain in Crisis, the Urgent Case for Public Ownership and Control. I'm Sian Errington from the Labour Assembly Against Austerity, and I'm going to be facilitating this session, which I'm really pleased we're having, and I'm really pleased to introduce the two speakers we've got today. I think it's, you can tell from how the issues of public services and public ownership have popped out throughout the day, how central it is. And it's such a caricature that's sometimes thrown at the left that we don't talk about the issues that really matter to people. And actually at the moment we see, the complete crisis in our NHS, as Helen was talking about, and how the government are hardwiring in profiteering private companies through the health and care bill. We've got privatised water companies dumping sewage into our seas and rivers. We've got privatised energy companies operating in a completely broken market going bust, and energy bills going up and up and up. We've got private companies deciding what bus routes they can run and what bus routes they can cut. And that's before we even get on to trains, our education, social care, our communications, such as our mail and our broadband. All of these things are not abstract. They are central to how we live our lives in this country and the type of society we are. So I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker today from Cat Hobbs from We Own It, who have done so much to put these issues on the agenda in the last few years. Cat, please kick us off. And we've just lost Cat. So because we're very pushed for time and I'm very keen to get around to questions in, I'm going to hand over straight over to our second speaker, who is Jon Trickett. So if I hand over to Jon, and Jon is going to kick us off.
These things are meant to happen. And first of all, congratulations for the organisation of this important event. I'm always really impressed by the amount of effort which goes in to these events. And they are important because showing that we're here, that we've got a strong organizational base, and we've thought through the issues, we've got a strong intellectual case, is important. And as we know, there's an attempt to drive the left into the margins of politics and society and the economy as a whole. We were not going to allow that happen. And that's why these events are so important. But we want to talk about, I want to talk about wealth in Britain, and I've been doing so for a while now. Those who follow these things may be aware that 3 or 4 weeks ago, my office published quite a detailed analysis of wealth in Britain, and the power of wealth and what we should do about it. And we proposed a wealth tax. We said there are at least 4 options, and it's worth having a look at the report. But in many ways, taxing wealth probably is, well, it's certainly not sufficient for the socialists amongst us. Private wealth needs to be taken back into public ownership. And I'm quite clear in my mind about that. So taxing wealth is an important thing to do because it allows us to debate the character of wealth in our society. And clearly it would help to create a more equal society. But if we actually want to transform our society, we're going to have to begin to talk about public ownership again. So I want to start this brief conversation which we're having off about the public utilities. But never forget, the public utilities are a case in point, but of a much larger issue. But anyway, look, let's start with the public utilities. Most of the public utilities were built and paid for by the community, either the councils or the state, and therefore by the taxpayers one way or another. And obviously, we used to, it may not be obvious, but we used to pay taxes, local taxes, to pay for the reservoirs which were built in my patch, for example, up in the Dales and in the hills north of Bradford and Leeds, which supplied clean, pure water to the great industrial conurbations of the West Riding, where I come from. But the gas, I'm old enough to remember gas lighting. The gas lighting where we grew up was provided by Leeds City Council. and so on and so forth. The health service, all of that was paid for by the people. And what happened, and we have been in retreat for 30 to 40 years, as gradually these huge aggregations of wealth, but public wealth, were transferred into private hands. And what happens when that takes place is the services no longer are there to provide a public service, which is what they ought to be. The primary thought every morning when anybody who works for public service wakes up should be, how do we provide a better service to the public? The truth is, once it becomes private, then the shareholder interest, the idea that this is a service for profit, is the first thought, which is in the minds of the senior management. And we know why, because they're coining it in themselves, as we'll see in a minute or two. So it's not difficult to see that over time, as private interests dominate the way in which we construct those public services, and we're talking about the post, we're talking about water, energy, and so on and so forth, and the health. The quality of the service, the idea that the public service is the central ethos of those services, has declined. And there was the recent talk about the sewage from the water companies. And you know, if you think about the post office, I think 10,000 post offices have been closed. And the price of a stamp has increased, almost doubled, and so on and so forth. All of these privatized utilities, the railways, the buses, outside of London anyway, all provided for private profit. And just tell a short story. Not so long ago, we had a bit of a rebellion in one of my communities, because which I represent. The bus company had stopped providing the link through to Doncaster. It only was going to Wakefield, but many people wanted to go across to Donny, as we call it. So I fought for the reinstatement of the service to Doncaster, but in the meantime, a small one-person bus company had begun to provide the service. What did the large company do when they were driven by public opinion to rebuild the service to Doncaster? What they did was ran their buses 2 minutes ahead of the other company, drove it into bankruptcy, and then began to cut the service again. So, you know, we see this all over the place every day. And the services as a consequence of falling. My analysis, and I'm sure we all agree with this, is that it's because of private ownership. Now, there is a price to pay for private ownership. I mean, those who advocate it say it's somehow more efficient, you get more investment, and so on and so forth. Well, actually what happens is the people who own the companies, the shareholders, many of them are now based abroad, by the way, so we're remitting the money from our tax, the money we pay for water. I think 70% of the water industry is owned by companies based elsewhere in the world. But what is happening is they are creating profits, which are then used to pay dividends to their shareholders. And we know, for example, if you look at the rolling stock companies in the railway industry, £1 billion in the last year was paid in dividends. Meanwhile, people are struggling to pay the rail bills. And this £1 billion was during the pandemic, when much of the money actually came from the government because there weren't as many people traveling. That figure comes from the RMT. If you look at the energy companies, £23 billion in dividends in the last 10 years. It's 80% of all the profit which was made by the energy companies went in dividends, not into investing in clean, green energy. And we can go on. So that's part of what's happening, the dividends. The other part which is happening is the chief executives, the ones who manage the companies on a day-to-day basis, themselves are earning huge salaries. CEOs, chief executive officers in the water industry with annual salaries of £1 million. Meanwhile, they're cutting the working conditions of the people who work for them, often making people redundant using the vile methods that employers use these days, like fire and rehire, so on and so forth, all in the restless, remorseless drive for more profit. And we know what happens. The wages, salaries and wages of workers' salaries and wages go down. The service which are provided to the public deteriorates. The prices which are charged to the public go up. And what's it all about? It's all about the interest of private profit rather than public service. Now, I don't want to stray too much into health, because I believe that you've discussed it quite a lot during the day, but we see that what's happening is this process of privatizing public services is not at an end. The Tories and maybe other right-wing politicians, people who are maybe opposed to centre-left but actually to the right, don't see anything ideologically wrong or practically wrong with the privatization of the health service. But the public see something wrong with it. They're absolutely opposed to it. And what Cat Hobbs and her unit has done is shown time and time again, when the public are asked, they are not in favour of the privatisation of the health service or any of these other public utilities. So I just want to probably finish on this, and because hopefully there's some time for Q&A as well as for Cat to speak. If you think that the staff are treated badly, the customers are treated as bad or worse, and the whole system is now geared up to private profit, then what is the answer? And the answer for me is clear, which is to take these things back into public ownership. The public has been ripped off. They were our assets in the first place. We're now being made to pay for dividends for worse services. And the obvious answer is to take them back into public ownership and to stop further privatization. So now, and one point I haven't made, it's just worth throwing in, is a lot of these services are natural monopolies. If you think about the water that comes into your house, or the gas, or the electricity, or the railway lines that the rails run on, they're all natural monopolies. And they ought not, for that reason as well, to be in private hands. But with a monopoly, as we know, it will work against the public interest if it's allowed to do so. So there's plenty of reasons to do that. I think the left should be confident, the socialists among us should be confident that our case is a strong case. We have the public on our side. And by the way, for those who are still party members, and I hope you all are, the policies of the Labour Party still, through the conference, remain committed to opposing privatisation and for public ownership. So what do we do about the other large aggregations of wealth in our society in private hands? Well, if you take, for example, I'll finish on this point then, the internet, which rapidly went from Wild West to monopoly. So if you think about Facebook and all the other large internet monopolies, they're providing public services, and the provision of internet itself, clearly, broadband, is a public service. And that's why Labour went into the last election under Jeremy and John MacDonald, arguing for free provision of broadband into every house. That implies public ownership. For all those reasons, I think this is something where the left can be in a winning position. Our friends in the trade unions, our friends in the activists in the civil society, and the wider public are all on our side. We should be confident to get out there and make the case for public ownership. It's the way forward to build a socially just and less divided society than we have at present. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, John. That was a really good overview and a really good start to the session, because I think the restless, remorseless drive for profits from these companies is completely right and sums up their whole attitude. I'm now going to hand over to Cat, who, bless her, is like rejoined us. And hopefully we've overcome the technical difficulties now. Cat.
Thanks, Jon. I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Amazing.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for organising this session. Absolutely brilliant to be here and brilliant to hear Jon's speech. I'm hoping to share a few slides. Can we see whether that works? I'm from We Own It, and we are independent of any political party, but we obviously are very much wanting Labour to continue with its excellent policies around public ownership. And we make the case that privatisation has been failing us all for the last 40 years. And as Jon has said, what we see is that when our services get privatised, we see costs go up, we see quality go down, and we lose accountability over our public services. So some of the key arguments, some of which Jon has touched on already, public services tend to be natural monopolies, things like the railways, like the water, like energy transmission and distribution. We don't actually have a choice as consumers. And so the whole argument around having a market and having a choice just doesn't really apply. Profits go to shareholders when they really need to be reinvested into our services to make them better. We don't have the accountability that we should have as the public. And privatisation also creates fragmentation and cherry picking. So private companies like bus companies, for example, will pick the profitable routes and they'll ignore the socially necessary routes that might be going out to more remote areas because they don't want to pay for them. Comprehensive research shows that there is absolutely no efficiency benefit to having services privatised, in fact, quite the opposite. And we urgently need public ownership to solve some of our real world problems that we have right now. So I'm going to run through a few of those. So as we've touched on already, we've seen a huge amount of attention recently being paid to the fact that we have raw sewage flowing into our rivers and seas because the private water companies in England are refusing to invest the money necessary into the infrastructure. Even though shareholders have had £60 billion in dividends since privatisation in 1989. And we know that Scottish Water, which is publicly owned, is investing 35% more in its infrastructure, and it has far cleaner rivers and seas. So this is an absolute scandal, and it's just an example of how privatisation of water is really a legalised scam. These companies are working on behalf of their shareholders, they're extracting dividends, and they're using these companies as financial instruments where they know we don't have any choice. And so, you know, they will do what they like with our bills, and they'll do what they like with our rivers and seas. The good thing is that this issue is getting more attention now, but I don't believe it will be solved just through regulation. There is going to be a review into the industry. That's not going to be enough. Having Ofwat regulating the industry hasn't helped. And what we really need to do is bring the English water companies into public ownership, copy the example of Scotland, and start looking after our environment and investing in the infrastructure that we need for the future. When it comes to the energy market, as we've seen, energy supply companies who are the people that we deal with directly as consumers are collapsing all over the place. And we've just seen the collapse of Bulb, which is the 7th biggest supplier in the country. And the government has stepped in with £1.7 billion to rescue this company. And that makes absolutely no sense, because instead of doing that, they could actually set up a publicly owned supply company and make sure that they're using that company to give people affordable prices, to push forward green energy. And there are already what they call sort of default suppliers, publicly owned energy suppliers in other countries, like, for example, Italy, Germany, and the US. So why can't we do that here? It seems to be because we're so committed to the ideology of privatisation that the government would rather waste huge amounts of money propping up companies when they fail, instead of admitting, actually, there isn't much of a market here. Let's let the government step in and provide a default supplier the way they do elsewhere in the world. When it comes to public transport, as you all know, our buses and trains are far too expensive, our services aren't good enough, and we're not going to be able to solve the climate crisis until we have integrated, high quality, affordable public transport. We really need to be copying models like in other countries like Switzerland. Switzerland has the best railway in Europe. It is publicly owned. They have what they call clock face timetable bus services, which are every 30 minutes, even for small villages. It all joins up together. It makes it really easy for people to leave the car behind, not fly, and just take public transport. The good news on public transport is that we are seeing some shifts. So in Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham is regulating the buses. This is partly due to the campaign that we helped with, Better Buses for Greater Manchester. And now we're doing similar campaigning in South Yorkshire and West Yorkshire. And there's campaigning happening around the country to push metro mayors to regulate the buses. And that's a step towards public control. It's not full public ownership, but it's public control, which is the same as we have in London, and it's much better. What we ultimately need is public control and public ownership. We're also seeing on the railway, England is becoming a bit of an outlier because Wales has taken its railway back into public ownership. Scotland, as of March next year, will be bringing ScotRail into public ownership. And we've also seen franchises collapse. So East Coast, Northern and Southeastern are all being run by the operator of last resort. So obviously it would really make sense for the government just to bring the whole railway into public hands. I've included the NHS as well. I know you've talked a lot about it already. I think the really important thing to understand here is a quote that I'm sure lots of you will know from Noam Chomsky, which is essentially saying, I don't have it in front of me now, saying when the way that the government, the standard technique of privatization is for the government to defund services so that they get worse, so that people complain, and then the private sector looks like a shiny new solution. And that is what they're doing to our NHS and what this government has been doing for the past 10 years. And it's absolutely criminal. We're now seeing people dying in ambulances outside hospitals. And I think the really important message for Labour to keep pushing and for all of us to keep pushing is that the government has been cutting our NHS for 10 years, and that's why we're in the state that we're in now. We need funding for our NHS. They're giving funding to the private sector. They gave 37 billion to privatise test and trace. They're giving 10 billion to the private sector over 4 years to help towards the backlog. But when NHS trusts asked for 10 billion over the next 6 months to deal with urgent waiting lists, to deal with the backlog from COVID, they were only given half of that, which is absolutely diabolical. And since 2010, we've seen the loss of 22,000 beds because of austerity, because of purposeful government cuts. We've lost 100 plus A&Es, as Jon Trickett's office has been researching and talking about. And we've got a shortfall of 90,000 staff, doctors and nurses that our NHS desperately needs. So even before COVID, we had a waiting list of 4.6 million people. Now it's even higher. This is how they are pushing people towards the private sector, because people feel like, well, I can't get seen by the NHS, I have to turn private, and we can't let them get away with it. I just wanted to include a few slides showing the support for public ownership, the huge support for public ownership at the point of the election. I think it's really important to keep emphasising how popular Labour's public ownership policies were and are. And so this polling was at the same time as the election. These policies are incredibly popular with lots of different types of people all over the UK. So they're popular with old people and young people, with Leavers and Remainers. They're popular with people across the political spectrum, actually, as well as with Labour voters, and across the country, across different parts of the country. So really important to keep looking at that evidence. These policies are popular. And obviously with Labour voters, a few stats here showing the policies are even more popular with Labour voters. And during Corbyn's period as leader, public ownership was talked about more as an idea, and that meant that it became even more popular during that time. So this is encouraging, and it means that we need to keep talking about public ownership, and we need to keep talking about how popular it is, and that it is a vote winner. It's a vote winning policy across the board. One of the key barriers, I think, around this, though, is that it's seen that nationalisation is expensive. So just a few key stats on this, and maybe we need to put them on buses and put them, drive the buses around the country. We're wasting £13 billion on privatisation every year. That's because of money that's going to shareholder dividends. It's because of the higher cost of borrowing in the private sector. And it's also that privatisation is more fragmented, and that makes it less efficient. So that's £250 million every single week that we're wasting on privatisation. And if we brought public assets and public services into public ownership, that would pay for itself. So in the case of assets where we actually need to buy back the companies, that would pay for itself in around 7 years. So that's actually a very, very, very good investment on behalf of the government. And we need to be talking about that and making that case proactively and talking about the waste of privatisation rather than being on the back foot when it comes to these policies. And we just highlighted a few examples of what that money could do in terms of practical results. So if once we've brought water into public ownership, we'd save 2.5 billion a year. We could, for example, invest that in reducing leakage. We could also invest it in tackling sewage, upgrading the infrastructure, etc. If we brought energy networks, so that's transmission and distribution, not so much supply, into public ownership, we'd save 3.7 billion a year, enough to buy 222 new offshore wind turbines every year. This would have a massively big effect on what we could do in terms of a green transition. And then just an example of Royal Mail as well, that would also save us money, and that would be enough to open new post offices, new post banks, etc. So this would have a real impact on people's lives. I want to quickly just talk about the fact that the public ownership of the 21st century is not the same as in the past. I think we can build on the successes of the past in the welfare state, and we can make public services even better. So when Labour consulted on what democratic public ownership should look like in 2019, at We Own It, we wrote a report, which was our response to that consultation. It's called When We Own It. You can find it on our website. And it's a model for what we think public ownership should look like, how we can involve the public, people who use services, workers and communities, civil society, in making sure that public services are working as well as they possibly could be. And the idea is, how can we make it even better than it's ever been before? And how can we make public ownership so good that it can't be dismantled in the future? And I think that kind of long-term horizon is still what we should be looking towards. I'll just quickly mention a few points about the political situation we've got right now for public ownership. Obviously, you all know these are difficult times. We have an 80-seat Tory majority. We have a lot of lies and confusion because Boris Johnson tends to talk about how he is taking back control of the railway with Great British Railways, or taking back control of the NHS. It's all nonsense. They are continuing to privatise our services. There's a lack of clarity, as you will know better than me, within Labour about public ownership that needs to be sorted. Public ownership is still being seen as radical when it's actually just common sense. And of course, the media, as I touched on earlier, we have to work out how to shift the narrative so that privatisation is understood in the media to be incredibly wasteful. But on our side, we have the fact that there is huge public support for public ownership, lots of support within Labour with the grassroots and the shadow cabinet, Ed Miliband, Jim McMahon, the Green New Deal motion at conference, etc. We have the victories that I mentioned on buses, rail franchises coming into public ownership, the outcry over sewage in rivers and seas. And so we're hoping that we can either win campaigns, win what we can, or we can grow as a movement and be ready to intervene at the right moment. So I will leave it there. Please do join us if you haven't. And yeah, looking forward to the next bit of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kat. And I think on YouTube and Zoom comments and Facebook and Twitter and all the people that are watching, there's a lot of appreciation for both Kat and Jon's kind of running through and going through the arguments with people, because I think it is one of those things that people instinctively know they support, think it's complete common sense, know that it's really popular, and I think it's always really good to refresh the arguments in people's heads. And I think that's also demonstrated by a lot of the questions that we've had come in are what I call the how we can questions. People are like, and I think it also demonstrates that this is a topic that people really want to get stuck into and campaign on. So I'm going to like sort of smush a lot of the questions together and run through them, put them both to you, and ask you both to be quite quick, I'm afraid, because I don't want to we can't overrun this session because we've got a brilliant last session coming up at past. So we've got a question from Geraldine on Zoom, which is specifically around sort of how we can bring the NHS back into public ownership. So not just defeat the health and care bill, but bring the NHS services back into public ownership. I think a question from Wanda on Zoom, but also a few others about how we can get out the kind of the profiteering that goes on, like bonuses, dividends, in terms of like supporting that this is public ownership is a common sense sort of argument, how we can sort of get out the arguments around how these private companies actually operate. Question from Charlie on YouTube, and also like a few others along similar lines, which was, we know that these things are popular. Opinion polling consistently shows huge support for greater public ownership, as you showed in your slide, Kat. But how do we get that to be reflected in Westminster and media discourse? And a few others sort of like asking basically like, how can we campaign? What can we get involved in? I quite liked the bus going around with the £250 million a week, but all other ideas I think for thrown out there for people to get involved in. So if I go to maybe Kat first, and then Jon, if you could finish by kind of summing up the whole session as well as responding to some of those questions. Kat.
Great. Yeah, brilliant questions. So in terms of the NHS, I mean, we're in, obviously, as you know, quite a dire situation right now. The health and care bill that is going through Parliament, that just passed through Parliament on Tuesday, is now going to the House of Lords. We've just set up a petition to the House of Lords focusing on a couple of aspects of that. We are arguing that private companies should not be allowed to sit on NHS boards making decisions about NHS spending and care, obviously. So we're pushing for that. We're also saying that the NHS must be the default provider of services, because what the Tories have done is effectively they've removed Section 75 from legislation. So what that means is there isn't the same accountability around contracting out, but they haven't removed the role of the private sector. So the risk is that the private sector gets contracts, but with even less accountability than has been already. And what we've seen during the pandemic is, you know, huge numbers of crony contracts given out. And so it will just be business as usual unless we can push back against this. So we really need everybody in the fight right now against this bill. Those are just two issues. There's a whole NHS movement campaigning against the whole thing, because the whole bill is very bad news. It's introducing integrated care systems into our NHS, which is an American model basically, and it creates the wrong incentives and is likely to lead to cuts to care, etc. So it's all very bad news. It's important to keep our morale up. It's important to do what we can. So please do sign up to our campaign, weownit.org.uk, but also keep our NHS public. They're doing amazing work on this. Obviously, the new campaign that Corbyn and others are part of, Your NHS Needs You, is really, really important. Lots of different organisations doing important work on this. So get involved if you're not already. Ultimately, if we wanted to reinstate the NHS, which we do as a fully public service, 3 out of 4 people want that to happen, we would need something like the NHS Reinstatement Bill that people like Alison Pollock have worked on, to kick the private sector out of our NHS altogether. And that's how it should be. But that would take extra legislation to make that happen at this point. And so I think we have to build and build and build and turn this into an election issue for Boris Johnson, where people understand that the NHS is being privatised. People understand that it's not acceptable and that, you know, it's having terrible results. Yeah, how can we show that the profiteering is happening and make that case to people? I mean, I think people quite intuitively understand that it doesn't make sense for public services to be privatised. The clue's in the name. When we did a bit of polling to find out why people support public ownership, the top reason was that people believe that money should be reinvested back into services rather than going to shareholders. So I think people do get that, but we have to grow this movement, you know, and make the case and get these figures out there so that people can really see privatisation is wasteful, this money shouldn't be going to shareholders, and really bang home that message and try to put our enemies on the back foot, really, with it, rather than it being seen that, you know, we've got this crazy idea of nationalising things and going back to the 70s. It should be, why is it acceptable that these privatised services continue to rip us off, and really putting them on the back foot with that. Just a final note about what people can do. So as well as the health and care bill, we're also going to be campaigning more on Channel 4, which is really important because Channel 4 could be privatised, but the government hasn't made up their mind yet. Nadine Dorries said this week that they genuinely haven't. Channel 4 is one of the few media outlets, as you know, that actually holds the government to account. So it's really important that we keep it in public hands. It seems like the sell-off plans are at least somewhat politically motivated. So do get involved with our campaigns to help push back against that too. And there's other people working on similar things like the Media Reform Coalition. So yeah, I'll leave that there.
Thank you so much, Kat. And I'm going to hand straight over to Jon.
Well, I think we're probably running quite tightly, so I'll try to keep it fairly brief and sharp. I mean, I think there's still a battle for what I might call the soul of the nation. What kind of country do we really want to have? Do we want a country that's altruistic, where each one of us is responsible for each other? And when one person's in need, we step up to help, because one day when we're in need, they will help us. Or do we want a society that's like the law of the jungle, where it's the strongest, the fittest, and the wealthiest who survive and prosper? The rest just can go to the wall. And the NHS, the battle for the NHS encapsulates all of that, because the central ethos of the NHS is that you will get to your position in the queue according to the severity of your illness, not the size of your wallet. That's why the Tories hate it. They absolutely hate it, and they want to move on. Now, I just want to take a side step a minute into this care proposal which has emerged, where the right-wing papers are trying to make out Boris Johnson is somehow this genius for saving care of the elderly and other people who are in need of care. I mean, what he's done, as you know, is he set a cap. They will take all the money for you for care up to £80,000, and then they'll leave you with the 80,000. The first 88,000 is what you pay for. The rest of it you're left. Now, I've got villages in my constituency where the average price of the house is less than the cap. I don't want to name them particularly because I don't want to, you know, end up sort of castigating them. People are wonderful people, former miners who I represent, mining communities. But if the average cost of a house is 86,000, as it is in some villages, then all of the money that you've put into buying that house will have gone. But if you live in Boris Johnson's seat, the average price of a house is £500,000. So they're going to be left with £410,000. But something more insidious than that, and it's wrong. It's simply wrong. Everybody in the country who's faced with the facts must know that it's wrong, except the bloody Tories. But something more sinister is going on, because the Tories are now saying to the middle class people who can afford it, the more prosperous people who afford it, by the way, whisper, whisper, we're setting up an insurance, a private insurance system, which will allow you to insure against the 80,000. You pay so much a week or so much a month, and it won't cost you a penny when it comes to disposing of the property. So the privatisation of the way in which we pay for the health service and our care is now imminent. It's now ingrained absolutely into the legislation and the kind of proposals which are being prepared. It's not where the British people are. It simply is not where they are. And we have to articulate what's happening, and we have to fight for it. Now, so I'm trying to illustrate the idea that there are two ethical systems in our country fighting out for supremacy. On the one hand, there's altruism, caring for others, and the other one is the greed, law of the jungle kind of thing. And who, best of all, illustrates the difference between the two ethical systems? I would say this: it's the staff. It's the staff in the health service or in the schools who represent that ethos. And the staff are organised in trade unions, and the unions understand entirely that once something's privatised, something precious is gone, because they see what happens to their staff. And you will encounter staff in schools that, where they're being privatised, the cleaning service or whatever, heartbroken that they can no longer provide the level of quality of care which they would want to provide for those kids, just for cleaning the school or whatever it might be. So we're largely probably today we're political activists of one kind or another, or we're in the voluntary sector. But the trade unions are also at the core of this battle, and they understand it. So we have to build a coalition, because reaching from the staff into the unions and then to the patients or the people in need of care or their relatives is not a massive bridge, to a chasm to bridge across, and it can be done. But we are fighting a battle because the media simply will not tell the truth. And therefore, it's down to us, to our capacity to organise, our capacity to speak, to think, to communicate our ideas, to build an unstoppable movement based on the idea that there are two ethical systems, one of which I think represents the best of humanity and the best of Britain too, and the other one which represents this capitalist ethos that we've got to resist. I am confident we can win the argument. But we need to be confident as a movement, and we do need to speak to the staff, to the trade unions, to activists, to those people who receive the service, the parents of the kids and all the rest of it. And we've got a fight in our hands, because we've been in retreat, other than during the Corbyn years, when we talked about this and you saw massive advances in public opinion in our direction, almost in response immediately, as if the public have been waiting, almost our nation have been waiting for somebody to say the truth about what's been happening in our society. And you will, if you look carefully, you see the polls change under Corbyn's leadership. It's quite dramatic, and it hasn't yet gone back. So look, there's a fight in our hands, but we can be confident if we fight it that we can win the argument. And we're doing what we can in Parliament, but as you all know, we're in a small minority. There's going to be one in the country who can to help in the country, but also in the House of Commons too. And by the way, thanks to Jeremy, we have actually got a small cell, we'll call it that, of Red Lords who are very, very good, fighting the good fight in the Lords, the people who Jeremy put in there, possibly slightly against his instincts, because we really want to get rid of the Lords. But yeah, there is something to be done here, and I think we can win the argument. But congratulations to Cat Hobbs and to the team who put this event on. It's a very important one. Let's keep up the fight, comrades, because we've got to win it.
Thank you, John. I think that was a really great summary, I think, of both the arguments in terms of like their practical economic value, but also like actually how this is an issue that does speak to who we want to be as a country, and it is about a moral and an ethical and the right thing to do is to provide universal, comprehensive public services, and it is very much about the soul of the Labour Party in the country as well. So I think that was a really brilliant way of finishing this session, and hopefully all of you watching will have seen, as well as like the things that Jon and Kat said, there have also been lots of different ways of getting involved posted in the chat, so you can properly engage in these campaigns in your local communities, and the different campaigns happening nationally. So there is lots and lots and lots to do. There's not a shortage of things for people to be involved in at the moment. I'm going to finish up this session by, as well as saying a final thank you to Jon and Kat, but also giving you like a little housekeeping reminder for those of you watching, is that you're going to have a little 10-minute break now, so you can go away, make a cup of tea, come back, and then our final session of the day is starting at 4:30 promptly, where we're going to have Diane Abbott, Jeremy Corbyn, and international guests to really like finish off the day in a really brilliant way, I think. So we're gonna, if you're on Zoom, remember you can just leave us on, because we're just going to be broadcasting on this link. So you don't need to do anything, you can just leave it on your computer as you go away. And then for people on Facebook and Twitter, you will need to like just log into the new link, but it will be posted shortly. So thank you once again, and see you all in 10 minutes. Bye.